Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Strand. My name is Sabir. For a little bit of history, Strand was founded in 1927 by the Bass family over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until, after over 92 years, Strand is the sole survivor, still run by the Bass family, still housing new and used books, and running near 400 events a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Samuel Woolley to celebrate his brand new book, The Reality Game: How the Next Wave of Technology Will Break the Truth. Stepping beyond the epidemics of trolling, fake news, and other familiar phenomena, it examines and raises the alarm about what's to come, while arguing for a culture of simultaneous innovation, accountability, and particularly transparency. This book draws on Dr. Woolley's work as the research director of the Digital Intelligence Lab at the Institute for the Future, as well as his work as the co-founder and former research director of the Computational Propaganda Project at the University of Oxford's Internet Institute. The Reality Game is his first book. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and more, and he has also presented his work to NATO, the US Congress, and the UK Parliament. Joining him to discuss his work is Davey, Alba, technology reporter covering online disinformation for The Times. Previously, Davey reported at BuzzFeed's News, where her story on the use of Facebook in fueling Rodrigo Duterte's drug war in the Philippines won both a Livingston Award and a Mirror Award. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming them to the Strand.
Got some director's chairs here.
Yeah.
I like it. Not fall out of it.
Yeah. Is this on?
Mine's on, I think.
Hello.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah.
Hopefully we can have a good conversation. The book is fascinating, and I really recommend getting it at the end of this and get it signed, I guess.
Yeah, I'm happy to sign it.
So Sam and I know each other actually from, just like reporting on these issues. And this is the first time we're meeting in person. And we have more than that in common, actually. The book actually starts off with an anecdote about President Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines.
That's right, yeah.
And, I've written about this quite a bit, but the authoritarian regime over there is very much fueled by Facebook and other online social media platforms. I was hoping that you could tell us the story of what he said then, because that was, you did some research on the stuff that was going on there, and he came out with a comment about that. And just in the process of that, can you tell us about your work at the time and, just maybe some definition of terms to begin with?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Davey. So a couple years ago, I'm now at the University of Texas at Austin, where I'm a professor in journalism. But a few years back, before I joined the Institute for the Future, I was at the Oxford Internet Institute. And during that time, some colleagues and I had started this collaboration called the Computational Propaganda Project. And the goal was to study the ways that disinformation and automation and algorithms were being used in consort to try to manipulate public opinion around the world. So we wanted to study how social media was being used to try to manipulate people. And a couple of my colleagues, Samantha Bradshaw was the leader on this one. Sam had, it's kind of confusing because we're both named Sam, but Sam had started this project on cyber troops. And the idea was that we were going to study the ways in which governments had invested money into cyber troops, into groups of people that were using the internet to promote the official, basically the official line of the government, also to attack the opposition. And so it was a very interesting situation because it was unclear as to how much money was being given to these things. But in the case of Duterte and the Philippines, we actually were able to find like very clear evidence of like several $100,000 being spent during his campaign through Rappler, which you may or may not be familiar with, but Rappler is a great news source in the Philippines. Maria Ressa was one of the winners. Was it CNN Person of the Year or Time Person of the Year?
Yeah.
She was one of the co-winners of that. But they had reported that Duterte had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars during his campaign, and then into his presidency continued to do some of this stuff on bots, which are automated profiles, or specifically political bots, are automated profiles built to spread political propaganda, built to engage in political conversation. They look like real people, but they're actually controlled by a person that will control many, many different accounts. And Duterte had used these in concert with humans to spread pro-Duterte stuff, but also to attack a lot of his opponents.
And to take down a lot of the anti-administration people. So the Supreme Court Justice, and it's still a mess,
right.
actually.
Right.
So can you tell us, like, after you came out with that study that included information about that?
Yeah, so we had like included the information on this stuff, exactly. And Duterte was giving a speech, a really important speech before the country, and he said, a reporter asked him about the Oxford University report that we had put out. I was research director at the time. And Duterte responded and said, "Oh, like Oxford University, that's a school for stupid people." and said a few other choice things, but I mean, like, obviously you laugh, it's a bit absurd, but he sort of directly attacked us. But you've also experienced this, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely. And that's, well, we'll get into a lot of that in a bit, I guess. But it's interesting because you use that as a lead in your book, but you also say that it quote, was a parallel strategy for gaming the truth. And then you brought up the governments of Modi in India and Trump in the US, and sort of talked about how that there are parallels there. Can you just explain sort of what you mean by what are the same tactics and similarities there?
Yeah, so, and you asked me before, and I kind of glossed over, I had defined bot, but with Modi and with Trump and with Duterte and Bolsonaro in Brazil and Erdogan in Turkey, we're seeing the rise of something that we call computational propaganda, which is the use of automation and algorithms over social media in attempts to game the truth, to change the way that people think about things. And oftentimes, in the case of Modi, but also in the case of Trump, misinformation and disinformation are key tactics that are seized upon by the powers that be and their supporters.
Can we pause and define what misinformation is and what disinformation?
Right. So you oftentimes hear about it as fake news, which I encourage everyone not to use the term anymore, because it's been weaponized by the purveyors of fake news to kind of create attacks against people. Misinformation is accidentally spread false content. So it's something like, maybe a family member might spread unknowingly. Oftentimes, disinformation leads to misinformation. Disinformation is purposefully spread false information with the intention to mislead. So oftentimes, disinformation campaigns are built by powerful political actors, like supporters of Modi or Duterte or even Trump, and then used to get people to spread misinformation unintentionally. And so, so what we've seen with Modi and what we've seen with Trump and the other people that I've mentioned is the use of social media to create the illusion of popularity for certain ideas by using bots. So 10,000 accounts can basically come in and support something and make it look very popular, but also to kind of do the same thing against the opposition, to attack them with all of these accounts. And it's not just fake accounts either. It's also systematically organizing people and using those people to try to attack journalists, to attack opposition, and also
and
researchers, yeah, apparently, and to basically change what people are talking about. And oftentimes, actually, the targets are journalists. They're trying to get journalists to spread the fake news and or disinformation,
or to cover something as legitimate.
Yep.
So I guess, sort of towards the end of your book, you have this statistic, and it's really interesting. It's 90% of the online data available in the world was generated in the previous 2 years, which I thought was crazy. That means that most content online is relatively recent. And if you think about kind of the streams of online content that we're exposed to these days, a lot of it is garbage.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that means that most of the internet is not like archiving historical, maybe historical archives or like your GeoCities page from way back when. Right. But it's the posts and the streams and the tweets and all that.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, we have over 2 billion people on Facebook now, and we mentioned Modi and we mentioned India. Technology is getting to places where it's never been before, and it's leading to different sorts of consequences. It's leading to good things in many cases, access, like you said, to education and to good content. But also in the case of India and other places, it leads to disinformation can sometimes directly or indirectly lead to things like lynchings and death. We saw what happened in Myanmar with the regime there spreading disinformation on Facebook that led to the deaths of thousands. And also, I think like we're in this really pivotal time where the content, like you said, that's being created is a lot of noise oftentimes. With the rise of things like parallel computation and more advanced artificial intelligence, which I go through in the book like in quite good detail. It's probably boring, but I think the details are important because what it explains is that automation and AI afford things at scale in a way we've never seen before, and that's what we should be looking out for the next wave of this stuff. We're not quite there yet. In fact, what I say in the book is that most of the campaigns that were waged using social media in 2016 and 2017 were very unsophisticated. They used like these very basic bot accounts that weren't conversational, but we're getting into an era now where because new data is being created about the world and about us, that data can be leveraged using AI to target us with more specific advertising, more in line with what Cambridge Analytica claimed they could do, but actually didn't really do in 2016. We're beginning to see sort of the rise of that with things like political geofencing and geofarming, where you can like get people's third-party application data and figure out where they are specifically and then target ads at them and things like that.
And sorry, I am losing my notes. Oh, yes. So this was really interesting in your book, too, and you just alluded to that. But most computational propaganda attacks since 2010 have not been technologically sophisticated. That's what you said in your book. And I think that people still kind of have this idea that the IRA and the GRU operatives were these brilliant, like, digital operatives that had figured out how to make something go viral at exactly the time that they wanted it to go viral, and like insert some kind of like popular opinion whenever they wanted to do that. Can you explain what you mean by it not being sophisticated?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Davey. Like, I think that a lot of things were overblown in 2016, and the moral panic we've seen ensue because of social media has been in parallel with that. Part of the problem, though, is like, a lot of this stuff is justified because it's been a problem of technology design. What the Internet Research Agency, often called the IRA, confusingly, the first time I heard it, I thought it was the Irish Republican Army myself. But the Internet Research Agency in Russia, the people that were building these sort of bogus disinformation campaigns online, what they were actually doing was seizing upon weaknesses in the design of the technology that existed. What they had figured out was that things like social media trends were very basically constructed to favor quantity over quality. So if you could push tons of traffic at something, you could probably get people to pay attention. It's really akin to the idea we've seen in politics for hundreds, if not thousands of years, of the person who speaks the loudest gets heard, right? Or of planting people in the audience to cheer for you and things like that. But it's just doing this at scale. And so the IRA figured that out. But for every successful IRA, Internet Research Agency attack, or GRU, Russian intelligence attack, there was, 1,000 unsuccessful ones. And they were also using people in really unique ways to sort of seed and fertilize doubt as much as anything. It's an old KGB strategy, right? The goal wasn't necessarily to manipulate public opinion on a large scale using advanced or sophisticated technology. The goal was to make America talk about them doing that and make it look as if they were doing that, so that we spent several years worrying about the influence of Russian propaganda on elections. It's not as if there wasn't influence. There was influence, but I kind of I feel that our reaction to what happened was outsized compared to what the effects actually were at the time. And then the other thing is, like, a lot of this disinformation and misinformation that was flowing was coming from within America. It was coming from groups here as well. And we never really focused on that as much.
And sort of that shaking that foundation then makes, it's the basis of democracy in doubt. Can you put a finer point on that? Is it possible for anyone to make something go viral, and insert some kind of popular opinion whenever they want? Is that possible at all?
I mean, yeah, that's an important question, because I think there's the assumption that there has been the assumption that is the case. It's not. Now, I think that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and all of the other social media firms and other technology companies have made a lot of moves to change the way that trending algorithms work. And in a lot of cases, you're probably all thinking, like, actually getting rid of a lot of them, because they realized, maybe we're not defensible when we say we're not the arbiters of truth, which is like their favorite catchline, when we actually do create trends and do create like news feeds and we prioritize information for people. And so actually, and like I make this case in the book quite strongly, I think the people that are most successful at manufacturing trends and at getting things to sell and scale on social media are powerful political actors. Oftentimes it's, a regular person, and there's a lot of different bot makers and propagandists I've talked to over the course of this research around the world. But a regular person can do some things with bots or some things with social media. They can attack their opposition. They can dox people. They can scale like their own voice. But they have nothing like the power and the resources, the money, the time, the expertise that the IRA or GRU has, or the American government or the Filipino government.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So jumping forward to this year, a lot of us are really anxious about the upcoming election. And, your book, you make the case that online information campaigns might be targeting leftists now. It feels a little serendipitous given the Sanders-Warren news cycle now. Do you think the Russians are involved in that?
Ooh, yeah, good question. I think they'd like us to think they are, for sure.
Absolutely.
And to talk about it. No, it's okay, Davey, because like the thing was we were making these jokes then, and it turned out to be true, right? In 2016. So 2020. What's changing? The trends that I see are that the disinformation and misinformation campaigns that are being waged are being more targeted on specific demographic groups than they were in 2016. The Senate intelligence reports that were done collaboratively by several groups, including Oxford and the team that I worked on, what was talked about was attacks upon the African American community, attempts to spread information that you should vote on a different day than you actually should, attempts to basically do electioneering, trick people not to vote or tell them not to. We're also seeing a rise in attacks against issue voters. So people that are gun rights advocates or people that are global warming skeptics. It's really easy to manipulate someone when they believe something very, very strongly and they vote on a single issue. And so there's a refinement that's going on in terms of who's being targeted. And yes, I do think that like Democrats are, we know actually for a fact that Democrats have been targets already of propaganda campaigns in this cycle, and you've reported on it yourself. And so we know that that's going on, but I would say that while Cambridge Analytica, they made the argument. I met them in 2016 before they worked for Trump, and what they said in a basement in Chelsea just down the road, they said in presenting their stuff, demographic politics is dead. And I don't think demographic politics is dead. I think demographic politics is very much still here. It's just that we're using computation and scale to attack people that are still on the margins or still do not have much of a voice. And because a lot of times that 10% of people are who define an election, right? And so that's kind of the way disinformation's swinging at the moment.
Terrifying. So, keeping the theme of looking forward, a lot of your book goes through what's to come. In contrast to this unsophisticated campaign that we've seen in 2016, you talk about human-like automated voice systems, machine learning, deepfake AI edited videos and images, interactive memes, and virtual reality. And I was hoping you could give us a few examples of those things and what we might expect in the coming years.
So after spending so much time sort of litigating the past and thinking about what had happened and trying to suss things out and to follow the breadcrumbs, I kind of decided that, along with my editor and my agent and some other people, that this book should be a book about the future and about what I've learned and using history to think about what could come in the next 5 to 10 years. And so as a thought exercise, I went and started looking into a lot of the sort of like latest breaking technologies. And so you mentioned things like AI and VR. Obviously, they've been around for a while, but they're really on the cusp of like really launching off at the moment. And so with AI, it's been possible for quite a long time to build bots that are capable of interacting with people with a degree of authenticity. But it's becoming even more possible now. You talked about the profusion of data that exists online. Well, if we can get the secret sauce of marrying that massive amount of data that exists on people and combine it with advanced AI, conversational AI, then you could say have a bot attack a friend and attack them based upon their likes and interests and desires and be more convincingly human.
As opposed to like a blunt force.
Yeah. As opposed to using a bot to send 10,000 bots to spread the same hashtag over and over again or something.
Or the exact same message, something like that.
Yeah, which is like a lot of what we saw in 2016. For instance, during like the Nevada Republican primaries, there was a bunch of bots that looked like they were Latino that said, I voted for Donald Trump and not for the Latino candidates, to try to give, we thought to give Donald Trump a boost. But now we're actually seeing more conversational AI. Another thing is that VR is on the cusp. So I don't know if you have all followed this, but some leaked meeting documents from Apple recently said that Apple thought that by 2030 that VR could potentially replace the iPhone, which I thought was insane, And when I heard about these things, I was like, okay, well, what is VR going to be? What's it going to be like? What's disinformation going to be like in VR? And what I think is that the body has no metric for fake. So you can see something, you can hear it, but when you're in a VR simulation, it's very difficult. When we've already begun seeing some kind of indoctrination going on with VR, the Chinese government, I talk about this in the book, has used VR to basically interrogate low-level party members that live on the outskirts of sort of like broader Chinese society. And so people in Beijing will have a VR meeting with lower-level party officials and have them sit with them in a VR simulation and and interrogate them and make sure that they know what's going on. And so, VR is a very potent tool for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then the other thing, like human simulated voices, or voices that sound just like humans that are AI driven.
The Google phone calls.
Like Google Duplex or Google Assistant. The reason I wrote a chapter, I wanted to write a bit on that, was that I watched the launch of Google Duplex and Assistant, and they used Google Assistant in the thing, which is this voice system that's meant to be sort of like Siri or Alexa, but it sounds just like a person. They use it to call and make a haircut appointment, and in the thing, the person on the other end of the line couldn't tell at all they were talking to a simulation,
and so they had like ums and
it was crazy.
Yeah, pauses, very human-like. It was uncanny to see in person. I was there.
You were there, right? And so the light bulb moment that I had when this happened was that in the early days of our computational propaganda research, we used to say bots are kind of like, it's like an advanced kind of robocalling or push polling. Like you're using this automation to like get out to voters you might not usually reach. And then I thought to myself, well, shit, like what happens when Google Duplex and Google Assistant start getting used by political campaigns to call people?
Have you seen examples of that?
I haven't yet. Okay. No, I haven't. But it's kind of like we're talking about defense against the dark arts here because we don't want people to go do it.
Right. Give them the idea now. Can you tell us what a deepfake is?
Yeah, so a deepfake is a video that's edited using machine learning, which is a subsection of artificial intelligence, making it look like someone said or did something they never said or did. And the way that you build a deepfake is that you get a bunch of images of a person. So online now we all have lots of images of ourselves making lots of different facial expressions, and you combine those images together to make it look like someone's talking quite convincingly. Really interestingly, there's been deepfakes that have circulated, and it takes quite a lot of technological sophistication to make one that looks really realistic. But there's been a lot of them that have been circulated. Jordan Peele, for instance, made one of Obama saying Donald Trump's a dumbass. I think a total and complete dumbass is what he made Obama say. But and it was obviously fake, right? But there's also been some that have been meant to be comedy that have gone viral and kind of spread as if they were real. It's like kind of like those friends that you see on Facebook that spread the Onion and like think that it's a real newspaper. And so deepfakes can do that. Deepfakes have a lot of potential though to make a lot of trouble. But we're also like finding some really different ways, interesting, cool ways to track them. For instance, there's researchers that have figured out that, hey, most of the time when people put their photos online, the photos that get pulled for deepfakes, they're not blinking. Because you don't want to post photos of yourself where your eyes are closed. And so if you watch a deepfake and you can build technology to if they don't blink, then you know it's a fake video, things like that.
And there are all sorts of weird tells for deepfakes. Can you go through some of them?
Yeah, they're kind of like pixely, like the facial movements look a little bit weird. Again, the blinking
perspective, like
yeah.
if their necks are like sort of like off kilter, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like the same thing you would kind of see with image manipulation.
Glitchy.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up deepfakes because like deepfakes are like sort of like the big thing that everyone has been worried about lately. They're like, what if a video comes out showing one of the Democratic candidates saying something they never did, or such and such, or what if something really bad happens, like a video comes out of Trump threatening nuclear war or something. But it's really important to know for everyone that like most of the videos and images that have circulated lately, like the Biden video that made him look like a racist, that was selectively edited, the video of Pelosi that was slowed down, the video of Acosta that made it sped up, that made it look like he was snatching the mic or hurting the person, those were all edited using like iMovie. Yeah. And they still managed to go viral. They still managed to become a thing. And so we still have a lot of work to do, and by we I kind of mean the technology firms have a lot of work to do to make sure that those sorts of videos that are facilely edited don't go viral. And
Facebook recently banned deepfakes, but not these types of. Yeah. So there's a term for it. They call it cheap fakes, right?
Yeah. So some people at Data and Society just down the street and Joan Donovan out at Harvard have done some great work on cheap fakes versus deep fakes, and made a very convincing argument that cheap fakes are a lot more worrying right now than deep fakes. And I buy it, because most people don't have access to deepfakes at the moment. But the thing is that Facebook is kind of they're trying to do something good, right? They're banning deepfakes, which is this very, very slim category of things. But it's another move by Facebook to sort of delay actually taking on the really big question, which is like the hundreds of thousands of other images that are actually facile, easily manipulated, or things like that. And again, it's because these technology companies don't want to be seen to be arbiters of the truth. They don't want to be seen as regulating speech. And right now we're in a really interesting time period, right, Davey? Like where we have to ask ourselves some really tough questions about who we want, like moderating our speech. And I think we all know that we don't want Facebook and Google to be the chief moderators, but we know though that they have lots of resources, they have lots of technological know-how, and so we've got to figure out something moving forward.
And they have the back end information as well, which
crucially
is crucial.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to ask is how might a deepfake be used in an informational campaign, disinformation campaign?
So, I've thought about this a lot. Yeah, there's the chapter on videos talks about this, and what I kind of think is that you would. Man, this is really Defense Against the Dark Arts. You would sow and fertilize an idea probably within a social network. So oftentimes what we saw with the Internet Research Agency is attempts to give an idea just enough traction in a Facebook group or on Twitter or on Reddit that people started thinking there was something to it. So you'd like sow an idea, say like QAnon or things like this. There's different conspiracy theories out there. And then once the thing picked up traction amongst the public, you would enter in and spread a deep fake proving the thing was true.
Got it. Yeah. There actually has been a story out recently about how static deepfakes, like just deepfake pictures, had been used in a bunch of profiles. So to make it look like there's a crowd of people supporting a certain idea, for instance, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And again, that's another way of manufacturing consensus. That's the title of shameless plug, my next book, with Yale Press. And manufacturing consensus riffs on Chomsky, and the idea that I have there is like you use social media to create the illusion of popularity. You use technology to create the illusion of popularity. And static deepfakes are a way of, like, for instance, that famous quote by Trump about his inauguration. It was the biggest and best inauguration ever, or whatever. Well, if you could put people in there and make it look as if it was, then you're kind of changing the truth.
So just last question for you. It's actually, your book is not that dystopian as we make it seem like it is. You have a lot of hope in the book, and you say, is the flow of technology so great that we cannot stem the stream of manipulative uses? In my work, in my line of work, some days I think it is too great and can't see kind of like the light in the tunnel. But you actually don't think that. You make a case for hopefulness.
I'm cautiously optimistic. After spending, the better part of 10 years studying this and thinking about it a lot, what I've realized is that the technological problems are one side of the coin, and the other side of the coin are the social issues at hand. And so oftentimes we tend to think about solutions to the technological problems only in terms of technological solutions. When Mark Zuckerberg went before Congress, he said the word artificial intelligence like nearly 40 times in his short hearings, because he used it as sort of like his MacGuffin, his like thing that he was going to use to solve the problem. But the reality is that polarization's at an all-time high. Trust in institutions in the United States and a lot of other democracies is at an all-time low. I talk through this in the book. And so we have a lot of work to do in the next 5 to 10 years or 15 to 20 years in rebuilding civil society and in rebuilding trust. I tend to think that in the United States that the pendulum swings, like very far both ways. And so I'm thinking that we might have a period of time in the next 5 to 10 years where everyone's obsessed with the notion of the truth, which can have its own damaging effects. And so I think that the hard work we have to do and the more long-term solutions that I talk about in the book are to do with things like critical thinking and media literacy that are built in such a way that they actually address the underlying causes of the problems at hand, like things like a lot of the reason that people in the alt-right spread propaganda or disinformation is because they want to feel a sense of belonging. Like, I just wrote a paper about the demand side of disinformation, and if you think about like the drivers, what drives people to do these kinds of things, it's a lot of times it's trauma, a lot of times it's belonging, and oftentimes when we're telling people that they need to change their behavior and they need to do something different, we provide them with no out. We give them no other. We're not saying, hey, you should sub this community with this other community. In fact, a friend of mine reminded me of a quote from The Art of War, which I've never read, but it's funny. She said, we have to build, in The Art of War, it says, we have to build a golden bridge on which our enemies can retreat. And so, maybe we need to be thinking about the different ways that we provide infrastructure and hope and community to people.
In the actual real world.
In the real world, yeah.
I guess you can do that in online communities as well, but sort of getting to the root of the problem.
Right.
We're opening it up to questions if anyone has any.
If you just like to raise your hand, I can run the mic to you.
I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about, do you think there's a responsibility on like Facebook, Google, in the people, you said like people took advantage of design weaknesses to build these other things. Is there like a way we can go back and prioritize quality over quantity?
Thank you. That's a great question. So the question is, can we prioritize quality over quantity? How can we rebuild the systems with, ethics and things like that in mind? And so in the book, what I talk about a lot and kind of my catchphrase is we have to design the next wave of technology with human rights and democracy in mind. We can't design the next wave of technology technology to replace these other social media systems with optimization for engagement in mind, which is what these platforms are built for. We can't design them for scale. Like maybe we won't be able to have platforms that have billions of users on them or even millions. And so it's a fantastic question. I'm not sure that the social media platforms that we know and kind of hate/love are salvageable. And I kind of joke around in the book and I say that they risk becoming legacy media as quickly as they became new media. I think that they've been constructed over the course of 10, 15, 20 years nearly, and the algorithms themselves have been built by lots and lots of people, and so it's kind of worrying to me to think that they're kind of trying to repair the jet while the jet's being flown. And actually that's a phrase someone at Facebook used to me.
The election in Taiwan last week, you had there a democratic country that was being targeted with artificial intelligence and everything from China, and it didn't work. So does that give hope that this stuff can only go so far, and people, on the other hand, can realize what is happening and what isn't happening? Or what did they use? Can you give us any information about how they did that and how they went about it and how it was combated?
Davey, have you written on this? Do you want to talk to it a bit?
Sure. So could you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah. The Taiwan election.
Yes.
China's was targeting Taiwan and a bit, so we all knew what was happening. We knew the motive, we knew the technology, or you might know the technology, and it didn't work because China won that. Could you tell us what they were using? How it was being combated on the other side? This is the disinformation and the false information on one side being combated on the other side by the political party that actually won the election.
There were a lot of tactics, I believe, used. So there was a lot of sort of like laundering stories into seemingly legitimate local publications that were actually run by China, I believe. And obviously there was a lot of propaganda on the social platforms as well.
Yeah. And then like in terms of like response strategies and why like, you know, Taiwan actually prevailed in this circumstance and the president got reelected, I think that you can look to Taiwanese society more than anything than actually, you know, the technological responses were manifold and we tried to do a lot of different things, and actually some of my colleagues are in Taiwan right now working on this stuff. But much like Germany, in the last German election, we worried very, very much that the far right was going to do a lot to take down the government, and they were spreading tons of bad content. But when we studied it at Oxford, we had a realization that nothing really was happening and people weren't spreading it and it wasn't really picking up steam. And when we dug a little further, we realized that it was because of societal differences between Germany and the United States. Germany has an incredibly robust public media system. They have an incredibly robust critical thinking sort of regimen in their schools, things like that. And I think that Taiwan has a similarly robust education system, and also Taiwan was very much prepared for what was going to happen because they had experienced it before in the previous election. In fact, I wrote a paper on the Facebook post the president made the day after she won the last election, and 40,000 messages, the first time I think she'd ever got over 1,000 responses to her message, came in effusively supporting the Chinese Communist Party and saying how horrible she was and all these things. So Taiwan had like gotten a kind of a whiff of what could happen and had begun to, you know, think about how to respond.
Yeah, I believe there's some reporting too on how some of China's tactics were not as sophisticated as, you know, sort of like creating new personalities. It was a lot of just like blunt force.
Yeah, and like
as we talked about.
Yeah,
earlier.
Totally. Jennifer Pan and Gary King. Jennifer Pan's at Stanford and Gary King's at Harvard have written some papers that are really fantastic on the 50 Cent Army, which is China's army of people that spread dis and misinformation. In fact, China really has leveraged people far more than it has technology. But the main tactic that King and Pan point out is that the Chinese government, when they use these kind of tactics, they use people to spread positive messaging. They pretty much predominantly they spread stuff about the party and how great it is and things like that, and that just didn't take hold in Taiwan this time around.
Hi, thank you both for a really good conversation. I'm wondering if you talk about how the platforms don't want to be and probably shouldn't be responsible for being arbiters of truth, and the government is also using them to spread disinformation and has a vested interest in being allowed to continue to do that. Who then is responsible for making large-scale changes? Like, do you just hope that some like benevolent Mark Zuckerberg comes in and makes a better Facebook? Or like, how do you make a...
I was curious about this because in your book you talk about the next wave of social media companies. Yeah. And I was curious if you thought that was even possible given the size and scale of the ones that we have now.
Well, yeah, so that's a fantastic question. The first, there's three ways I look at this. It's oversimplifying the case, but there's user-driven responses like the populists. There's technology companies doing something, and then there's governments doing something. And somewhere within there's also civil society, which plays a really key role as well. But in terms of like what the tech companies can do, they're making changes. I do not trust a benevolent billionaire to come in and save the day by any means. I do think, though, that the technology companies employ a lot of people who have a real vested interest in making the products better. And I've actually spent time with the research teams at both Facebook and Google. I was a fellow at Google during the 2016 election at Jigsaw here in Chelsea. And there are people there that are really working to do good. The thing is that companies like Facebook are run like autocracies. They're not run like democracies. So when all the good people at the bottom are saying, hey, we found evidence of XYZ, if Mark Zuckerberg or Sheryl Sandberg don't want to do it, it doesn't happen at Facebook, full stop. And that's become very clear to me. And so it's obvious that we need legislation and regulation. And it's unclear as to when federal regulation is actually going to come up and actually be passed. There's federal regulation that's on the books that's sort of been written up and ready to go up, that's sort of waiting to be shot out of the quiver. And I'm really excited about it because I know a lot of very smart people have put their heads together to create it. It's just a matter of the government being willing to pass it. Until then, we have states attempting to pass laws about this stuff, and we've seen some interesting laws come up. We've also seen municipalities like Seattle, for instance, digging up old laws on the books to try to combat this stuff. I think we've got to come at it from a lot of different angles. I don't think there's going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to the problem, but I'm pretty upset that like regulation hasn't happened at all, and I'm really, really fed up with the idea that this is just a user issue. Like, I spend a lot of time in Palo Alto and Silicon Valley and for my work, and I hear so much from academics there, from technologists there, from political people there. This is a user issue. We need to give people the power to make this all better. I don't think people caused this problem, or at least people didn't cause this whole problem. And so you can't just build a new patch or plugin or app that's going to solve this issue. You can't just give people more information. In fact, the stuff we know from the research shows that fact-checking after the fact doesn't really work. And so we've got to rethink these things.
Hi. Kind of going off of that, recently there's been, I think, Jack Dorsey of Twitter, I don't know if that's his last name for sure, but he announced that Twitter would stop taking money for political ads. So that was an action that he took as the CEO of Twitter, whereas like Facebook and other companies have stayed silent or have like absolutely refused to act on that subject. Would you say that action by Twitter is enough to kind of keep the ball going? What are like the potential implications of that action? Yeah,
that was an interesting move from Jack Dorsey, and it is especially interesting because Facebook was in the middle of all this criticism, at the center of all this criticism about allowing lies in political ads. And so in some ways, Twitter announcing that right then and there was PR. Like, it's good PR in a way. And the thing with Twitter is they don't really make a lot of money on political ads anyway. But that is, there's been a lot of discussion about this. A lot of people sort of have the point of view that it is not just that is not the only solution to like these lies and political ads, especially when you think about nonprofits and issues like climate change and, you know, the activists that are part of these issues. They kind of have to reach certain demographics as well.
Yep.
So the targeting in those cases is important. And so, I don't know, I think we find ourselves somewhere in the middle. I don't know if you have any other
No, I
thoughts on
agree
that.
with that. I think there's always two sides to the story, right? Like, there's people that make the argument that we should get rid of anonymity altogether, but then in fact, activists in you know, countries with no democracy need anonymity in order to communicate. And so climate activists also need advertisements on these platforms to communicate with publics that they might not get to. I think you're absolutely right that it's about optics, and I think that the social media companies up until very recently have been mostly concerned with optics and PR. Like, that's like the way that they've been thinking about how they can address this issue, and they're realizing that's not going to work. I do also agree that political ads are the tip of the disinformation and misinformation iceberg. Like, we talk about political ads as if it's an end-all be-all, and that's why Mark Zuckerberg sat before Congress, that and Cambridge Analytica and those sorts of things. But political ads are oftentimes not the main place where disinformation gets spread. Disinformation actually mostly gets spread, and computational propaganda gets spread through the Facebook groups pages. It gets spread through actually mainstream Twitter. It gets spread through Reddit, through 8chan, through Gab, all of these other platforms, and through, you know, regular sorts of conversations. You know, advertising has existed for a long, long time, and people have been able to use political ads, you know, in many ways
To lie.
Yeah. Despite, you know, the FEC and FCC allegedly being in there to prevent that, even though they don't look at the online sphere at all. But yeah, I think Twitter is trying to put its money where its mouth is, to sum up. I think they're doing some good stuff. I've been more impressed with Twitter than I have with any of the other companies lately. But again, like, you have to wonder how much of it's competition and how much of it's actually going to lead to real change.
So I'm a little curious about the general perspective that I think you're taking when addressing these issues like the rise of populism and misinformation. I think you're generally focused on agency being in the hands of these propagandists and these intentional perpetrators of misinformation. I also was at Facebook during Trump's election, and I think from that vantage point, we called those groups like bad actors, and they certainly are significant in the ecosystem. But from my perspective, which certainly does not reflect any companies that I've worked for, I think that the greater agency involved in this kind of like rise of global populism, I think lies in the algorithm itself. So even if we didn't have any of these bad actors, if we have an algorithm that is promoting content not based on its truth or its worthwhileness for people to read, but entirely based on its engagement, whether people are engaging with it, I think you exactly would expect a rise in populism. This is what populism is the rise of things that are popular. So I would be curious to hear your take on kind of, if you had to try to allocate blame for this on these like intentional propagandists who are, as you granted, are unsophisticated versus the platforms themselves. I'm curious to hear a little more about that.
So I think that's a point very well taken. The algorithms what the algorithms are optimized for very much matters, and being optimized for engagement or being optimized for
maximizing revenue or attention.
You took the words out of my mouth. Yeah, I was trying to think of a good way to put it. Obviously that's going to lead to, or maybe not obviously, but the research that we've been able to do without a lot of access to the actual algorithms themselves externally has been able to show that yes, like we're starting to see that polarization and populism and things like that are a consequence of these things. And I think that reporting's waiting to be broken on these subjects about the algorithms and their effects. But I think so I think the technology companies they have to answer for this, and they've done a lot of fancy footwork to kind of avoid making it seem that the algorithms are actually part of the problem, because they want you to think that the algorithms are math, that the algorithms are software.
And neutral.
And that they're not encoded with values. But if you read Safia Noble, you know that algorithms are encoded with the values of the people who build them, right?
Yeah. Safia Noble, Algorithms of Oppression. Is that what you're talking about? It's a great book.
little follow-up on that. So I would just like redouble that point that like literally I think the core values of Facebook are like directly reflected in the core algorithm, in the core metrics that they measure every test against. So they're running tens of thousands of tests every day, and like you can see the values right there. Like
I think you're right.
There's nothing neutral about data.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that given my scholastic background, my attention oftentimes is paid to power in forms like governance, in forms like armies, intelligence services, and things like that. What this work has really taught me is that power takes a lot of different forms, and that we have to look to things like companies and to their creations in order to really understand how power functions in today's world. So yeah.
Hi, Sam. I want to bring it back to humans, because I think that we're talking a lot about the impact that a lot of these bad actors are having, but without thinking about like who that is actually impacting and the impact it has on us. And we've been talking a lot about disinformation, misinformation, but we haven't spoken about filter bubbles, which is also a term that I'm kind of remiss to use anymore. But you know, even the people in this room are here because they recognize that this is a problem. And the way that information spreads is because you have a belief or a shared idea that you want to share with others. And I'm wondering how technology could maybe be used in the future to make us all see the same reality instead of all of these different fractured ones.
That's a really good question. You talk a little bit about filter bubbles in your book, right, Sam?
Yeah, a bit. The research is out on that, right? And that's why I know you said you're remiss to use the term. So there's disagreement in the research community as to whether or not social media drives what's called homophily, which is the idea of birds of a feather flock together, like whether or not you push people together using social media or actually you're bringing them together. I do think, Georgia, that it's a question of design again, like in a lot of ways. Like I think that technology can actually be prioritized, and you're right to point out like maybe we can build new platforms that are more oriented towards like, you know, generating conversation. For instance, Facebook has said that they want to create like a virtual living room space in VR, which is a very interesting thing. But like, and you're all shaking your head because I think what you know is that that leads to all kinds of other questions and quandaries right away. Like I won't bring them up, but anyway, so yes, like, you know, we can build new forms of technology that are built with inclusivity and shared values in mind. But that's, you know, it's a really tough one, right? Like I look to like things like Mastodon or Mozilla or Signal and all of these companies, and there's a trend right now towards going back to encryption and going back to private messaging and going back to chat applications like Signal or like WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook. And so sort of we're not seeing the democratic form of the technology being built yet.
But how do we depolarize the conversations we're then having on those platforms?
So, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but one idea you propose in your book is the sort of going back to IRL, strengthening of community ties, media literacy. You know, your book is very solutions focused.
So the solutions focus in the book is like, you know, the lion's share of it is social and cultural. It's not technological. And so, in fact, like what I say in the book, and like the reason I talk in these terms is to make it a bit more simple for myself to think about, but I talk about short-term, medium-term, and long-term solutions. And so if the long-term solutions are things like critical thinking and media literacy, then perhaps short-term solutions are efforts that are geared towards educating people during the process of voting. But again, like I said, I've kind of been enlightened in the last few years about dealing with the root cause rather than just dealing with sort of the symptom, and using medicine as an example and thinking about it. And I think that medium term, perhaps one of the other things we need to do is again think about community and think about inclusivity and think about trauma and think about things like the psychology behind this stuff. We've spent so long as a research community, relatively speaking, 5 years, talking about the supply side of disinformation, like where it comes from, who's doing it, how they're doing it, and why. We haven't talked very much about the demand side, and so we need that research. And so I just wrote a paper on it, but it's more like laying out all the psychological principles we would think about, but we need more work.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question.
Hi there. Yeah, it just seems that where do you fit on the spectrum of, Cambridge Analytica? It seems like you've been minimizing its impact. It was started with Steve Bannon. It was, there's a documentary out, The Great Hack. There's a woman out who was a whistleblower for them. It seems like, and they've influenced Brexit, apparently elections all over the world. And it seems like they were able to get to the undecideds, which is a very dangerous thing. So we don't really see that. So it seems like they've sort of weaponized data. And even Facebook's own vice president said it got Trump elected. And yet he didn't want to change the policy. And Mark Zuckerberg had a secret dinner with Donald Trump in the last year. So, I mean, it seems like you're minimizing the actual impact it's having on the undecideds, which really is very important in our electoral system.
I think what I'm trying to say importantly is I'm minimizing the technological sophistication of the Cambridge Analytica platform. And Cambridge Analytica came out, there's a whole long history there of SCL Group and of basically working as a defense contractor and a lot of different things. And so when we talk about the effects that Cambridge Analytica had, we're actually talking about SCL Group, which is a different thing entirely. Cambridge Analytica itself claimed that they could do something called psychographic marketing, which is based on something called the Ocean model. And so what they said that they could do was they could map out people's personalities based upon the data that they could get from credit reporting agencies and from companies like Facebook, and that they could then build psychological profiles of people and then individually target them with messaging. What I'm saying, in fact, is that they didn't really do that. They absolutely got to undecideds, but how did they get to undecideds? Through Facebook's primary advertising mechanisms. So Facebook, Twitter, and Google, if you read Dan Kreese and Shannon McGregor, Facebook, Twitter, and Google had people embedded with the Trump campaign with desks next to Brad Parscale, who's now the campaign manager, telling people at the Trump in the Trump camp what they should do to get the best optimization. And what did they land on? Well, let's do campaigns in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, all of those places. And so, yes, they had a big impact. Donald Trump spent more on digital media than Clinton, and that's the only place, more on online advertising than Clinton, and that's the only place he outspent her. She way outspent him on TV, radio, everything. But Donald Trump and Cambridge Analytica, which was a consultant working on behalf of the Trump campaign, had the power of the social media companies behind them.
Do you think there needs to be a little bit of air let out of this idea that Cambridge Analytica had this magic formula to...
Yeah, I do. Yeah, because there was articles written right after the fact saying the rise of the weaponized AI propaganda machine, and Cambridge Analytica really didn't have such a machine. They had a fancy marketing campaign. Brittany Kaiser, who's the person you're talking about, who's the whistleblower who I've met multiple times, was basically selling this idea that they could use advanced AI and psychographic marketing, and that was this special sauce that they had created. But in fact, when we dug deeper, I'm an ethnographer, right? So I go spend time with the people that actually build these things and talk to the folks. When actually we went and spent time with them, it was really clear that it was pure marketing shtick, and that they were hanging out with Facebook, and Facebook was giving them access to an incredible amount of data on people.
And sorry, on that note, let's let's please give Davey and Samuel a round of applause.